At the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, I had managed to put together a small batch of films, between 15 and 20 films, which had been very much, I suppose, funded modestly, either by my own income as a film editor or from various funding bodies who were endeavoring to help young filmmakers at that particular time. The BFI was doing just that, and one of the prime enthusiasts for me in my association with the BFI at that time was the director of the Experimental Film Fund. The basic premise was certainly to encourage young filmmakers just beginning to learn their vocabulary. And a gentleman there, Peter Sainsbury, who indeed had supported a lot of my films already, was very much aware that most of the technique and the structure and the strategy of these films was really more based upon a documentary premise than it was certainly on notions of dramatic narrative in the cinema. And this was no surprise, because I think I had a lot of theoretical ideas to explore as I saw them in terms of the documentary genre. And also my day job, so to speak, was working in documentary activity in London television programs. I spent a long time at a place called the COI, the Central Office of Information, who purportedly put out documentaries about the British way of life to the rest of the world. So I was interested in as it were, the credo of the documentary, the notion of telling the truth through the notions of the moving image. So I was using those sorts of techniques, often with a great sense of irony, in the manufacture of the short films that I was pursuing. But finally, Peter Sainsbury gave me a good piece of advice. He says, instead of making films where all the characters address the audience directly, why don't you actually experiment by asking the characters to talk to one another? So I went away, and after about 6 months, I produced a script which ultimately became the background for the film The Draughtsman's Contract. I had not long come out of art school, and I was interested in the whole field of aesthetics. And one of the dictums that I was taught at art school was you should draw what you see and not what you know. There was a particular period, I suppose, that I was also interested in terms of painting, which in some ways is a bit paradoxical to the arguments I've just expressed, but was the whole notion, I suppose, of the Baroque. So I wanted to make a film along the premise of draw what you see and not what you know, with a background of North European Baroque painting. And I wanted to make a very painterly concerned film that used all sorts of painterly attitudes towards composition, both in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and I wanted it to be very much associated with landscape. So I needed, in order to pursue these ideas of draw what you see and not draw what you know, to put it into an English language, an English landscape setting. And you can see by the very way that I'm describing the beginning of this film, it maybe is a rather unorthodox way to consider filmmaking, which very largely takes on a property, a literary property, and intends essentially to illustrate it. Here was a series of ideas. I had no idea how to characterize them, how to set them, but needed to find a way to explain these particular fascinations. I had a young family, and we used to holiday in the English countryside at a place called Wardour, not very far away from Salisbury. And I was in the habit, in happy summer days, of sitting in the garden and drawing this large country house. Very soon it became apparent that as the sunlight was so bright, the shadows very rapidly moved around the corners of the house. And if I was interested in the dictum of draw what you see and not draw what you know, I certainly had to either wait until the following morning, when the shadows would be in the same size to be accurate, or indeed maybe to consider a second proposition, which was to set up 4 drawing places, one on either side, on all 4 sides of this particular country house, and move my chair, so to speak. So from 9 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock, I might be on the west side of the house, and then from lunchtime to the middle of the afternoon, move round to the next side of the house, and so on. And this exactly, really, in principle, is the background to the story of the Draughtsman's Contract. The concept then of a draftsman drawing, even in its widest sort of consideration, doesn't seem to be a particularly 20th century occupation, so it seemed necessary to take this back in time. And we set off on a whole long expedition, which took in fact several months to find the ideal place, and this is all relative to the actual making of the film because the place was going to somehow determine the narrative. Finally, we found a late Jacobean house in Groombridge in Kent, and from there I could gradually see how I could put this whole thing together. I finally settled on the date 1694, which really is an interesting focal point, I think, in English history. On the English throne came William III, who married an English queen, Queen Mary, and we have this period, a very short period in English history, simply called William and Mary period. It sees the beginning of the formation of what could be described as English capitalism. It's the year of the formation of the Bank of England. There is a certain amount of legislation passing through the English Parliament that gives women certain control again over their property, and all these considerations about property, about female power, about notions of art and patronage, and a change from the Frenchified Baroque to the more severe, classically oriented Dutch. All these factors became part and parcel of the manufacture of the script. So politics, aesthetics, culture were all scrambled together in what I thought to be a fairly accurate disposition of, for me, what was a very, very exciting time. We settled down then for 8 glorious, extraordinary weeks in an English summer. Very rare to get 8 glorious weeks of good weather together. And that, again, was very instrumental in the way we actually organized our material. The costumes are exaggerated far further than historical evidence would ever suggest, and the characters behave both with incredible visual and oral formalism. Everybody stands foursquare to the camera, and lines are delivered with a great sense of deliberation, with very clean and careful use of consonants and vowels. There is one particular character who is simply referred to as a statue, who, in a sense, breaks free. In a sense, if the human beings behave like statues and the statue behaves like a human being, and we played with this idea, and I suppose classic use also of the notion of the fool or the jester. We have a figure that, as voyeur, viewer, if you like, has certain permissions and certain behavior patterns in the film, which makes him omnipresent to all the activities, which a large number of the other more important characters apparently do not see, cannot perceive. The film is very, very, very symmetrical, again, like notions of classicism. The house and gardens are always seen, as far as is possible, from a very classical, balanced point of view, and the film itself is hinged on a central point. You start the film believing that our central hero, the draftsman himself, is in total control of the environment around him, but rather, again, like the premise of draw what you see and not what you know, because he refuses to draw what he knows, he gets himself into deep trouble, and exactly at the midway point of the film, the whole drama hinges around. So instead of him becoming the main perpetrator, he in fact becomes the major victim. Now, if an audience is bamboozled by all these attempts to put in so much information and to cram the frame with reference and symbolism, be not afraid. In the heart, I suppose, the whole film could be regarded as an Agatha Christie country house mystery, and it could certainly be enjoyed on that particular level. There are clues, there are red herrings, there are all sorts of associated characters that could conceivably have motive. One of the things I think, though, that did maybe at the time perplex certain people, in classic Agatha Christie sense, at the end of the film, just in case you haven't fully understood all the twists and turns, everybody comes together. That's the police inspector and all the major witnesses, and there's a denouement, a finale, where everything is carefully explained. I was determined not to do that in this film, though it could very easily have been done, thinking that there was sufficient drama and intelligence and sense of comprehension within the film for any audience perfectly well to work out all the mysteries.